When the Sega Genesis Mini was first unveiled at Sega FES 2018, to say I was excited would probably be a bit of an understatement. It looked so cool. Of course, they showed off the Mega Drive Mini, which is what it was known as in Japan, and I was just instantly in love with the system. But over time, we got more information about it, and it just seemed like it might be a bit of a disappointment. Supposedly, AT Games was at the helm of this system, and AT Games just doesn't make very good Sega Genesis stuff, let's be honest with you guys. So Sega ended up canceling their partnership with AT Games and decided to do this system in-house. Well, at Sega FES 2019, it was unveiled once again, but this time we got a lot more information about it. We actually saw some of the games, we saw how the system would look, and I was absolutely ecstatic. Now I know what you're saying to yourself, well, RGT 85, aren't you a Sega fanboy? Can't you play all these games already? And you would be correct. I could play them on this. The beautiful Sega Genesis Model 2. What a great looking system. It's so nice, so sleek, so sexy. But maybe you don't want to play it on the Sega Genesis 2. Well, that's okay. We can play it on the premium Sega Genesis model, the Sega CDX, allowing me to play my Sega Genesis cartridges, my Sega CD games, and attaching a 32X to play 32X games. Sure, it looks kind of like a toilet bowl once you put it together, but it's still a great way. But maybe I want to play them on an HD television. So then I can use this, the Mega Retron HD, a fantastic budget plug-and-play system that allows me to play my Sega Genesis cartridges on my HD television. But maybe I want something a bit more, like the newly released analog Mega SG, a fantastic premium Sega Genesis system that will also hook up to my Sega CD as well. I can do a lot with this system. There's a lot of options and features. We will be doing a full review of this system very soon. But yes, suffice to say, I have a lot of ways to play Sega Genesis cartridges. But of course, the Sega Genesis Mini is designed for people without Sega Genesis cartridges, meaning that it is a true plug-and-play system, which I also have systems that do that as well. And there's going to be people out there that say, well, why don't you just get a Raspberry Pi and play them on that instead? And it's like, I don't really like Raspberry Pi. I like Apple Pie or Cherry Pie by Warrant. She's my cherry pie. Like, that's a really good song. It's kind of weird and creepy at the end of the day, but still not a bad song. But I still feel like even if you have a Raspberry Pi, even if I have all these Sega Genesis models, there are still definitely reasons to be excited about the Sega Genesis Classic. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and let's talk about why I'm excited for the Sega Genesis Classic.
Hey, RGT 85. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards! So the first reason I am excited for the Sega Genesis Classic is look at it. Look at the system, it's freaking beautiful. This is absolute majesticness. It is clearly modeled after the Sega Genesis 1 model, which of course was the first Sega Genesis model that came out stateside, and a very popular system. It does have better sound than the Sega Genesis 2 model, and we're not even gonna talk about the Sega Genesis 3, even though I own one of those. I like to pretend it doesn't exist. But the Sega Genesis 1 model is still the model that a lot of people look out for today when they're collecting for Sega Genesis stuff. I do have a Sega Genesis 1 model if you're wondering why I didn't show it in that elaborate intro, but I just don't know where it is. It's in a box in the closet somewhere. But yes, I do have one of those systems, and I always love the look of it. It just looks so cool, and I always thought it was a great looking system. Now, what's nice about the Sega Genesis Classic is that for $80, it comes with two different controllers that you can use to play multiplayer games. And these are 3-button controllers that are modeled after the original Sega Genesis controller, which was a fantastic controller. Let's be honest here. A lot of people consider it to be one of the best controllers of all time, and I would have to agree with them. The D-pad was great, the buttons were very responsive as well, but you might be saying to yourself, well, what if I wanted to use a 6-button controller? And that's where things could get pretty interesting with the Sega Genesis Classic, because it's actually USB controllers. So more than likely, you'll be able to use the new retro-bit controllers that are USB controllers designed for Sega Genesis Play. And I think that's a really good thing as well, because you're gonna want 6-button controllers to play some of these games. Now granted, we do not have the full game list already available to us, but there's probably gonna be some games on there that would be better suited for a 6-button controller. Of course, if you had a Sega Genesis, you could more than likely play most of the games with a 3-button controller, and by using some button combinations, you could simulate the experience of a 6-button controller. But I'm very excited because I feel like it will take some of the 6-button controllers, the USB ones, so that's going to be a big addition in my opinion. Another reason why I'm very excited for the Sega Genesis Mini is the fact that this is Sega's first attempt at a plug-and-play console as an in-house Sega. All of the previous Sega Genesis plug-and-play systems that you've seen throughout the years have been done by AT Games. Now, I'm not an AT Games hater by any stretch of the imagination. I think they do okay work with earlier systems, things like Atari and Intellivision. I always thought their plug-and-play systems for those consoles were pretty decent, but when it came to the Sega Genesis, something was always definitely lacking with these systems. Everything just felt very cheap with these systems. Whether you're talking about the sound emulation, that was definitely not accurate to the Sega Genesis in any way, shape, or form. It was like a couple pitches off with some of the games. You'd be playing Sonic the Hedgehog, and it wouldn't sound like Sonic the Hedgehog. There was screen tearing. There was a lot of issues that went into the AT Games Sega Genesis models. But now that Sega themselves is working on this, it's going to be a lot better. Who's handling the emulation for the Sega Genesis Classic is another reason to be very excited for this, and that is M2. Now, if you're not familiar with M2, go over to the Sega Ages stuff on the Nintendo Switch eShop and play Sonic the Hedgehog there. M2 did the Sonic the Hedgehog version that's available in the Sega Ages games available on the eShop, and that is arguably one of the finest renditions of Sonic the Hedgehog I have ever played. It looks absolutely gorgeous. It looks better than anything I've ever been able to do with the Sega Genesis model. It looks great, it sounds great, it plays great, and there's additional features in there as well. And it looks like there's going to be some additional features that will be available with the Sega Genesis Classic that Sega isn't really talking about yet. It's going to have save states, of course, because it is an emulation-based system, but it seemed like there might be screenshots involved as well with this system, and so I'll be kind of curious to see how they will be able to sort of transport these screenshots from the Sega Genesis Classic onto your mobile device or your computer, if that is indeed a feature. It looked like they showed it off during Sega FES 2019, but I could be wrong on that. Like I said, the whole presentation was in Japanese, so it was hard enough. But the fact that Sega is doing this in-house and M2 is handling the emulation of this, you should be very, very excited for that. But you could have the best emulation in the world, but if the games suck on the system, nobody would really care about it. And like I said, there are 40 games that are going to be coming on the system, and 10 of them have been revealed. And luckily, the 10 of these games kick ass. The first game that's been revealed is Ecco the Dolphin, which is an interesting game. It's definitely very unique, and it was definitely very different than what we saw at the time, but I always loved Ecco the Dolphin. The creator of Ecco the Dolphin also went on to create Colibri on the Sega 32X, which was a fantastic game. It would be cool to have him in my 32X book, wouldn't it? But yes, Ecco the Dolphin is an absolutely fantastic game. And then you have Castlevania Bloodlines, an absolutely fantastic 2D Castlevania game that has just been sort of lost to the sands of time. When you talk about the classic Castlevanias, nobody ever talks about Bloodlines, and it's a shame, because Bloodlines is a fantastic Castlevania entry. It is super underrated, and the fact that the cart is very expensive for Sega Genesis collectors kind of makes people not want to pick up this game. But the fact that Castlevania Bloodlines is going to be on this system is absolutely fantastic. You then have Space Harrier 2, which was a solid version of Space Harrier, the arcade game. You have Shining Force, which is a fantastic strategy RPG. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, which is an underrated puzzle game, I feel. You have Toe Jam and Earl, which of course I've seen a resurgence with Toe Jam and Earl Back in the Groove. I never understood Toe Jam and Earl on the Sega Genesis, and that game has been skyrocketing in price as well. So it'll be great to have Toe Jam and Earl on the Sega Genesis Classic as a way to finally check out that game now that I sort of understand what Toe Jam and Earl is all about. You also have Comic Zone, which is one of the hardest games in the world. If you've ever beaten Comic Zone, let me know in the comments section down below, because I want to give you like a medal, because that game just absolutely kicks my ass every time I play it, but it's a super unique game. You also have Sonic the Hedgehog. Surprise, bitches! Sonic's gonna be on this system. I know, it's an absolute mind-blowing matter that Sonic the Hedgehog is going to be on here. But like I said, M2 will be handling the emulation of this system, so that's very promising in my opinion, because that was one of the best versions of Sonic the Hedgehog I've ever played. You also have Altered Beast that's going to be on this system, Wise from Your Grave, which, I don't know, Altered Beast is a game I never really got into, but I know Stupid Joe from GameSack is like obsessed with that game, so I'm sure he's very happy about it. It's a cool looking game, it's just something I never really super got into, but someone did send me an Altered Beast wallet once on the channel, and I was very appreciative of that. A very, very cool wallet. And the final game that has been announced for this collection is Gunstar Heroes, one of the finest Sega Genesis games, and once again, another game that kind of has been seeing some re-releases. We saw it on the Sega Genesis Classics collection, but still a fantastic game and a game that needs to be played by more people. But the real reason, the main reason I'm excited for the Sega Genesis Classic is simply for the fact that it shows that Sega is really starting to look at their back catalog of games. They're starting to look at their back catalog of franchises. They're starting to look at their retro history, which is what a lot of Sega fans such as myself want them to do. A Sega Genesis Mini, a Sega Genesis Classic is a step in the right direction. The fact that they're doing stuff like the Sega Genesis Classics collection on the PS4, the Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. The fact that they're starting to do more stuff with the Sega Ages collection, taking arcade games, bringing them over to the Nintendo Switch, games like Virtua Racing, and adding in more features. It's really promising for the future of Sega, because a lot of us feel like the future of Sega needs to be sort of rooted in the past. They need to acknowledge the Sega Genesis, they need to acknowledge the Sega Saturn, and they need to acknowledge the Sega Dreamcast, because that's why a lot of people are still fans of Sega, because we grew up with Sega. So to see Sega finally returning to their roots is absolutely fantastic in my opinion. It gives me hope for the future of something like a Sega Dreamcast Mini or a Sega Saturn Mini, now that emulation is coming along very strongly for that system. It's just a great thing to see. You're starting to see more and more Sega franchises come back from the grave, and I absolutely love it. So this is a very important thing. Something like the Sega Genesis Mini will show Sega that there is a lot of demand for their classic stuff, and we want more of it. So that's why I'm excited for the Sega Genesis Classic. I have a million ways to play Sega Genesis games. I have a modded Xbox that has every Sega Genesis game ever on it, and you can always download ROMs and emulators, but there's just something about holding a new Sega product in your hand, a new piece of Sega hardware in 2019 that's just so damn special to me. So let me know in the comments section down below what you think of the Sega Genesis Classic. Do you plan on picking one up? Are you excited for the system? And most importantly, we still got 30 games to go on this system, so what are some of the games that you want to see on it? And as always, thank you guys for checking out this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Like I said, we're going to have an analog Mega SG review up on the channel very soon, probably by midweek once I finally can sink some time into it. Check out other videos on the channel, and as always, I will catch you guys on the next one. Later.